We're faced with the threats of climate change in many, many ways. And even here in this country, we can also speak of many examples that we have also been experiencing over the last few months. In this country, we've seen rising levels of rivers that were hitherto not the case, which has led to flooding as we speak in about 6 regions across the country. That's evidence of what climate change can do to us if we do not pay attention to it. And a man who has committed most of his life to talking about the impact of climate change globally is here with us today in this country, Ghana. He's the former Vice President of the United States of America, His Excellency Gore. Thank you for accepting to sit with us.
Thank you for having me.
Sometime last year, you made the statement that today, as every day, we're spilling 162 million times man-made toxins into the environment. And as we're releasing them, it's as much as 600,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding every day on the continent, in fact, and throughout the world. Has the situation improved?
No, unfortunately it's gotten worse, and the climate crisis continues to get worse faster than we are implementing the solutions. We have the solutions, but we need to remove the obstacles to implementation. When I say it's getting worse, yes, we're still putting 162 million tons of heat-trapping man-made pollution into the sky, and the sky is a very thin shell around the planet. It's just 5 to 7 kilometers thick, the part that we're filling up with this pollution. It's the blue part of the sky where the oxygen is. And it is now trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 750,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding on the Earth every day. The amount continues to go up because this pollution stays there. On average, each molecule lingers in the sky for about 100 years. But again, we have the solutions. We just need better policies and a greater sense of urgency to implement the solutions.
And do you see that sense of urgency, at least, over the period? And what do you hear world leaders talk about? Do you sense that there's that sense of urgency to deal with this threat that we're faced with?
I sense a great sense of urgency among young people, including young people here in Africa. And some leaders have expressed an adequate sense of urgency, but most have not. And the fossil fuel companies, coal, oil particularly, and gas, they are better at capturing politicians than they are at capturing emissions. They have seized control of the policy-making process in too many countries. So you see subsidies for the use of fossil fuels, even though they're destroying the future of humanity. You see them trying to block the installation of windmills and solar panels and the shift over to electric vehicles and the implementation of battery factories. So Africa has contributed the least to this crisis, but it is suffering the most in many ways, and it has the greatest opportunity to implement the solutions. 60% of all of the solar energy that hits the land masses of the earth is here in Africa. And solar electricity is now the cheapest electricity in the history of the world, and it continues to get cheaper. So Africa needs to, in my opinion, break free of fossil fuel colonialism and implement the solutions to the climate crisis that will benefit Africa, create a cleaner environment, create 3 times as many jobs as money invested in the dirty, poisonous fossil fuels that dominate today, and give young people a sense of hope about the future, which is also very important.
And you talked about that fossil fuel colonialism. You spoke about the World Bank being a part of this fossil fuel colonialism that's being pushed, especially with Africa being a victim of that strategy. What do you mean by that?
Well, that is one area where we have had some progress. The former head of the World Bank was a climate denier in league with the fossil fuel polluters. But we now have a new head of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, who understands the need to solve the climate crisis, and he is moving boldly to implement new policies. But the World Bank also needs an infusion of more money from the wealthy countries of the world. And the World Bank, in cooperation with other multilateral development banks, should help to organize a program of debt reduction, debt cancellation, debt relief for African nations in return for agreements to protect nature and to adopt better climate solutions, because the indebtedness of African nations has risen in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of Russia's sadistic invasion of Ukraine, which has pushed food prices much higher. So we also need reforms in the global system of allocating capital so that countries in West Africa, for example, don't have to pay interest rates that are a multiple of the interest rates paid by nations in North America and Europe.
And do you see the sense of reception of this proposal on the part of the World Bank to accept this the debt cancellation, debt forgiveness option to also offset the impact that some of these policies is having on the continent of Africa?
Those discussions are just beginning. The concept of canceling debt in return for protection of nature and protection of the climate was a concept that began 30, 40 years ago, but it needs to be returned to the global stage, because the debt service payments here in Ghana, well, in Africa generally, the amount that African nations pay to service their debt is twice as high as the amount being invested in renewable energy. That's obviously not the situation that we need, and the world as a whole needs to rise to this occasion and work with Africa and all the nations of Africa to implement these reforms.
And it is that commitment that I ask whether that is being exhibited. Do you see this happening, that there's a commitment to actually help Africa in this regard?
Well, I think the new head of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, as I said, is committed to the kind of progress we need. But the wealthy nations that should be recapitalizing the World Bank and helping the World Bank do its job, with them, that discussion is just beginning. The African Leaders Climate Summit a few months ago in Nairobi was really an inspiring event for me, because the African leaders spoke very clearly about the need to put a tax on these polluting fuels and to seek reforms that will enable African nations to gain more access to borrowing money and gaining financing for the installation of renewable energy.
You talk about the world leaders having a credibility problem.
Well, for example, the conference of the parties that will be held in Dubai next month, the head of that conference is the CEO of one of the largest and dirtiest fossil fuel companies. That's absurd. That company, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, is beginning plans to greatly expand their production of oil and gas by 50%. Their PR firms advised them to hold off until 2 weeks after the summit meeting, but they're expanding the production of these polluting fuels even as the world is trying to reduce the emissions from those fuels. And they lack credibility when they say that the solution is to try to capture the emissions, to go ahead and burn more and more oil and gas, but then try to capture the emissions as they're burned. It doesn't work. It's not practical. They can capture a little bit at great expense, but it's not a realistic solution. The solution is to phase down the use of fossil fuels and to phase out fossil fuels, when instead these companies are doubling down on more and more fossil fuels.
You earlier made reference to the heads of states of Africa, the climate summit in Nairobi. For us here on the continent, listening to all the speeches that were made and the commitments, the verbal commitments that were made to help fight climate change on the continent, there's a lot more focus, or that sense that you get the leaders on the continent looking at what they can get from this climate change conversation in terms of the monetary value of the trade measures that are put in place as against the commitment to really fight climate change or put measures in place to address the issues of climate change on the continent. So beyond the words, do you see any sense of commitment to put policies in place apart from what the monetary value they can get?
Yeah, well, it varies from country to country. Yours is a perceptive question because, yes, you will often hear these leaders put most of their emphasis on getting money from the rich countries. And I sympathize because the African nations need to get more money in order to move forward. But that should not be the primary objective. It's difficult to come up with solutions that don't require money, so I understand what they're saying. But there are a lot of initiatives that can be taken by African nations themselves, even as the world responds to this need for more resources. For example, many African nations are still subsidizing the burning of fossil fuels, forcing their taxpayers to give money to the fossil fuel companies to encourage more and more use of fossil fuels. Instead, those subsidies should be removed and the resources should be put into the energy transition and the sustainability solutions that are going to help us resolve this climate crisis.
Because you talk about solar being one of the cheapest sources of...
The cheapest now. It's the cheapest source of electricity in the history of the world.
But here in Ghana, it's actually a very expensive option, even though we have a lot of sunshine, for that matter, because of the cost of acquiring some of the solar panels and so on, which is not a government policy as yet. So you will still, as an individual, have to commit a lot more money if you want to have solar as an alternative source of power for you to use.
Well, it's interesting here in Ghana to look at what just happened this summer in Nigeria, where the new government there eliminated many of the subsidies for petrol. And what happened? So many of the businesses in Lagos have stopped using diesel generators and have installed the solar panels on their roofs instead. And once the taxpayer subsidies, the government subsidies for diesel are removed, then the solar electricity is much cheaper. Yeah. So part of the solution to this barrier that some have felt in installing solar is to eliminate the subsidies for the dirty diesel power and fossil fuel power. And when you burn fossil fuels, whether it's diesel or petrol or coal or gas, you not only create the climate crisis, it also creates conventional air pollution, which kills millions of people around the world every year. And the conventional air pollution here in Accra is due to quadruple in the next couple of decades because of the increasing use of fossil fuels. Instead, we could make people healthier with cheaper sources of electricity that have no pollution whatsoever. And the studies show that for each dollar invested in renewable energy, there are 3 times as many jobs created as a dollar invested in the dirty and poisonous fossil fuels.
You've been committed to this fight against climate change, and and then also all the practices that increases pollution globally. As a young congressman, as a vice president, and over the years that you've tried to put in all the measures and travel around the world to make your case and get the message across, do you think that you've gotten this message across quite clearly as to how the danger we're faced with, the threat that we're faced with right now as a result of climate change?
No, I don't. I've tried, and I'm not done yet. And this training that I'm holding here in Ghana with the Climate Reality Project is designed to communicate this message more effectively here in Africa and here in West Africa. I say that I have not succeeded yet because we have not yet seen the changes in policies that are necessary. Many people are still not fully aware of how dangerous this crisis is. It is not only the huge downpours that have caused the dams to fail and has caused flooding in multiple places in Ghana. It's also the melting of the ice at the North Pole and the South Pole is raising the level of the seas. And you know, in many of the coastal areas of Ghana, many buildings are being lost to the sea. And we are seeing temperatures increase. We're seeing new strains of mosquitoes carrying malaria taking root here in Ghana for the first time. This newly discovered mosquito is resistant to all of the different insecticides that now exist, and it carries both kinds of malaria. There are the droughts in the not far north of here are contributing to the violence in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, and of course there are murderous activities going on in Darfur today. The United Nations is telling us about this. There are multiple reasons why this crisis must be addressed. The experts on the climate crisis are telling us that we could have as many as 1 billion climate migrants crossing international borders to escape the heat and humidity that is coming as we continue to trap all this heat with the pollution. So it is extremely dangerous, and many people are still not aware of how beneficial the solutions are. We can have a cleaner environment, more employment, hope for the future. So this is an obvious choice. I am continuing to try to communicate as effectively as I can. And we have 1,000 new activists here being trained here in Ghana from all across West Africa. This is the 54th training of this kind that I have held, and we have many more planned.
Congratulations to you. It is in order. And this is a very, very important intervention, because even with this flooding that we are experiencing in this country as a result of the increasing water levels in the red, white, and the black voters that also now find their source into their Konsombo Dam, which led to the rising water levels in their Konsombo Dam, that led to the VRA having to spill excess water, that's led to the flooding in many areas, that's displaced thousands of people. There isn't even the appreciation that climate change really
is really the cause of it. And here is the reason. All this heat that's being trapped, the majority of it goes into the ocean, and that causes much more evaporation from the oceans to put moisture in the skies, so that when there is a rainstorm, it becomes much larger in a shorter period of time. The scientists call them rain bombs. And so the infrastructure can't handle these heavy downpours. And that's true in wealthy countries as well as developing countries. We're changing these conditions worldwide. We know the answer. We have the solutions. We need the political will to implement them, but political will is itself a renewable resource.
Political will is a renewable resource. Right. Let's get a bit more into that.
Well, when people gain the knowledge of what the danger is and what the solutions are, it makes it easier to form the political will necessary for people to reason together and decide to make a commitment to solve this crisis.
And do you see that political will being exhibited?
Oh, yes, I do. I particularly see it with young people. And young people in Africa have been lifting their voices and demanding change.
And then you see there's a lot of young people, even here in Ghana, demonstrations and so on, demanding that things have to change. Things cannot continue to be the same every time and expecting different results. Should that continue?
Oh, yes, definitely. And that's yet another reason to have this training here in Ghana. And, you know, sometimes when young people continue to advocate for change, and when Mother Nature intervenes with these terrible disasters, the older people say, oh, maybe these young people are right. Maybe we do need to change. Many policymakers are now beginning to change. Another factor that is leading to change is that the cost of solar electricity and wind electricity and electric vehicles continues to come down. It's already cheaper. It is beginning to be cheaper by so much that only fools would not switch over to it.
And for a lot of the young people, especially because they are not seeing the impact of some of these things that you talk about, partly as a result of issues with corruption and so on the continent, and I'm sure that bothers you as well. The increasing cases of corruption and so on, and the seeming lack of commitment by leadership to fight it. What has to be done?
Well, when I was Vice President of the United States, I sponsored international conferences to fight official corruption. And of course, it's a problem all over the world, but when it gets to the levels of hyper-corruption, then it changes everything. One cause of corruption is what the economists call a resource curse, when too much of a country's wealth is in one resource that is extracted in ways that enrich the wealthy elites, and the poor people don't get any benefit from it. And the wealthy elites sometimes become vulnerable to accepting bribes in order to keep this system going. In Nigeria, 86% of the balance of payments with the rest of the world economy comes from fossil fuels. 0.6% of the employment that gives income to the people is related to fossil fuels. So it drives inequality that becomes hyper inequality that feeds corruption. So getting away from this dependence on dirty and poisonous fossil fuels is one of the ways to fight against corruption.
And that's one of the many ways that can be done. What other ways, in your view, do you expect that the leaders on the continent must commit to fight corruption?
Well, transparency is the most important solution. There's an old saying that the best disinfectant is sunlight. When the people can see what is going on, then those who are tempted to be corrupt are scared to continue their nefarious activities.
Now, let's talk a bit about you announced something you call the climate trace.
Yes.
At COP27 last year. Tell me more about it.
Climate trace is a means of using artificial intelligence, not the ChatGPT kind, but the kind that takes many different sources of information and fuses them together. And we will have an announcement on December 3rd in Dubai that will multiply the information 1,000-fold. What it does is it gives the world a very clear view of exactly where the global warming pollution is coming from. There's an old saying in the business world that you can only manage what you measure. We're measuring the pollution and identifying where it comes from for the very first time. And that makes it easier for governments, for businesses looking for clean suppliers in their supply chains, and for NGOs and others to put pressure on the biggest polluters to reduce their pollution.
So you can use this climate trace to identify specific companies in specific countries engaged in some form of pollution?
Yes, absolutely. And we can also give options to large businesses that are trying to get cleaner suppliers so that their overall emissions are reduced. Some of the largest companies in the world are now using the climate trace data in order to reduce their emissions.
What's the ultimate goal? Is it to name and shame or something?
Well,
More like
that's part of it, yes, but it's more than that. It's also to identify the easiest ways to reduce the pollution levels and profit by doing so. Companies that want to reduce their pollution and their contribution to the climate crisis are more likely to do it if they can see how to do it without losing money. And there are ways. I'll give you an example. Some steel mills use a technology called blast furnaces. Others use something called electric arc. You can choose to get the same amount of steel in the same quantities with high emissions or with low emissions. If a large company needs to buy steel and it wants to tell its customers we're reducing emissions, we can tell them where to go to get the supplies from clean suppliers.
Your Excellency, I'll go. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
All
much
right.
for sitting with us. Appreciate it.